Hello and a very warm welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, a day after the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, was signed by 15 countries without India, the External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar said on Monday that the impact of the past pacts has been de-industrialisation and the consequences of future ones would lock India into global commitments, many of them not to India's advantage. He also said that those who argue stressing openness and efficiency do not present the full picture, and that this was equally a world of non-tariff barriers, of subsidies and state capitalism. 15 Asia-Pacific nations, including China, on Sunday signed the world's biggest trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, sans India, with hopes that it will help recover from the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic. The RCEP was signed after 8 years of negotiations at the conclusion of annual summit of Southeast Asian leaders and their regional partners held virtually this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. India, one of the leading consumer-driven markets in the region, pulled out of the talks last year, concerned that the elimination of tariffs would open its markets to a flood of imports that could harm local producers. But other nations have said in the past that the door remains open for India's participation in the RCEP, influenced by China. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze India's stand on RCEP. Joining me on the program today are Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador of India at the WTO, Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation, and Jitendranath Mishra, former ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Harshvi Pant, I'd like to begin the program with you first. Let's first try and understand why was this bloc initially formed and what are the benefits of such trade pacts?
Well, Frank, this was in the offing for a long time now, and you may recall it was last November that India pulled out from these negotiations which have been going on for years. And the idea was to create one of the mega trading blocs in Asia with ASEAN at its core and all the member states that trade largely which are large trading partners of ASEAN. And we have seen how the kind of contestation around globalization that has taken place over the last few years. This treaty, this agreement almost became one of the signposts of where perhaps regional integration might go. With all the opportunities and all the challenges that it presents for countries, including India. And I think, the arguments that India has presented, the arguments that India has made are very much in sync with the evolution in thinking, not only in India about the costs and benefits of such pacts vis-a-vis India, but also as to what is happening in the larger, economic global in the larger global economic space, where a lot of the assumptions that we were brought to, that we were raised with are being questioned today. And on the basis of those assumptions, on the basis of these newfound assumptions, we are looking at new economic realities being framed. Not only is this a question of the rise of China, but this is also a question of how do you reorient a global economic environment away from dependence on one particular country at a time when countries are looking increasingly inwards and trying to redefine their economic priorities. So when you talk of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, you also have to look at the interests of multifarious countries that were involved in this process. You have to look at the interests of ASEAN plus its surrounding member states, the partner countries that were involved in this process, as well as India, which has for a long time been contending that unless there are tangible benefits from this mega trade deal for India, it would not be possible for India to join. And therefore, India had presented a set of demands. And when those demands were not met last year in November, it was Prime Minister who announced that India would pull out of this agreement.
Absolutely. All right. So, Mr. Dasgupta, since we are here, then let's also analyze and talk about why India refused to sign the RCEP deal, or why did we walk out?
There were several grounds on which India was not satisfied with the final outcome. And India had, to be fair to India, it had been raising these issues right from the beginning. But it was told that these would get sorted out before the final draft was ready. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And undue pressure was brought to bear on India at the last stage. So some of the arguments that India had raised and which were not satisfied were first, that there should be a carve out for granting most favored nation status on investment. Because if India were to give, for instance, some special preference to Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or the European Union, one of the European Union countries, to invest in India, and on MFN basis that would get pocketed by the RCEP partners, that would not be in India's interest. So that was one. The second one was about the lowering of tariffs that could give rise to an import surge. And if that were so, then the, barring the secular increase which was to be provided, if the import surge went beyond that, then a country should have the right to impose safeguard duty. That was also not agreed upon. The third point was about the transparency obligations which countries were expected to adhere to. And the main objection underlying all these was the way the Chinese specifically use subsidies and state capitalism to circumvent the provisions of an agreement and to bring in cheap goods and then destroy the industrial growth that is taking place in a country. And of a piece with this was another point about the rules of origin. Now, in a plurilateral agreement of the kind of RCEP, there is a provision that the country where the most value addition has taken place, need not be the country of origin. It could be finished in some other country and it could be exported from there. So it would be taken as, it's known as accumulation of value addition. Now, in this case, because the duties were going to be different for, let's say, the ASEAN and China or Australia and New Zealand,
right.
So if the duties were to come down much later for China, China could circumvent and send the goods through ASEAN into India at a much lower rate, thereby defeating the provisions of the agreement. So all these were concerns which India had raised, but they were not satisfied. And that is why India had to ultimately, very reluctantly, walk out of the agreement.
Right, sure. Okay, points taken. Ambassador Misra, let's talk about any challenges associated with blocks like these.
Well, there are lots of challenges, and Ambassador Pant talked about the centrality of ASEAN in the negotiations leading to the conclusion of RCEP, and Ambassador Dasgupta talked of tariffs and other economic factors. And all this put together means that the challenge is, who is going to be central? Is ASEAN central in this? To me, it seems no. It is China that's central to it. Why? Because first of all, the United States and other major economies of the world are excluded. It was supposed to be a regional partnership, fair enough, but the United States is a regional power. So it was very expressly excluded. As far as India is concerned, as Professor Pant said, India's concerns were not met. We heard a statement by Secretary Riva Ganguly Das the other day. And we also had that excellent speech by Minister Jaishankar at the Deccan Dialogue, where he's talking about transparency, he's talking about too much of imports coming in, manufacturing not being properly based in India, and all kinds of things. So, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang called it a victory of multilateralism and free trade. Well, I think it is a Chinese-led multilateralism, that's what he meant, and free trade, a free trade for China. Because India was not just interested in free trade in goods, but also services, where our strength lies. So this is a big challenge. So this was not taken care of. Now, where do we go from here? Now that India has not signed, I see a very peculiar kind of Chinese, I call it a mixture of seduction and coercion, a Chinese persuasion, a Chinese style. It happened to be also in the CTBT negotiations many decades ago that it can't come into force without India coming on board. We are having something similar. Place is being kept for India for the future. And I read in the media that countries like Japan spearheaded the separate ministerial statement whereby India can become, if not a member, at least an observer to start with. Now, this is a kind of seduction. Why? Because the Indian market is a huge market. And tariffs. There is no transparency on tariffs. There is no transparency on origin and value addition. That is the key point. And what about FTAs? Is this the end of the world for India? Of course not. India has FTAs with many, if not most, of the member states of the RCEP already. And our experience in these free trade agreements has been very mixed. They have only had moderate success so far. So I think there was a review of everything across the board. The economic dimension is the most important, but of course also the political dimension. Why?
Right.
Because strategically, if it is going to be China-led and India has a political difficulty and a strategic problem with China, a border issue flaring right now, though we are talking about it, in the midst of this, it's going to be politically very difficult for India to come on board.
Absolutely. Absolutely. These are some very valid points that you've raised. So let's talk about, let's take this discussion forward and bring in a few more aspects as well. Harshvi Pant, we have FTAs with most of these countries. Rather than, China-centric multilateralism, shouldn't we be working towards and focusing on and strengthening the existing FTAs?
Yes, I think that has been that is the sense that you get that most of these FTAs where you have huge trade deficits that India has with the countries in question. I think that has been a challenge. Most of these FTAs have not really worked in ways that perhaps when they were crafted, it was envisioned. And so the challenge is, how do you recraft your economic strategy, which needs to be more in sync with the political strategic realities of the day, along with building the domestic strength of India, economic strength of India. And I think that's a very significant challenge that India faces going forward. So I think the idea that this is perhaps end of the road for India is misplaced. India will have to build its own capacities at the end of the day if India is to be a global player in any real sense of the term. And I think that's where the discussion is now moving to. How do you develop those strengths? And India possibly could not have developed those strengths by entering into this kind of an agreement. So the challenge remains, but also I think opportunities are there to build those kinds of capacities, which I think that the government is talking about, whether it is Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat, whatever you might want to call it. I think the idea is to build domestic capacity in the country, and then to wield that capacity to leverage that capacity to build partnerships with countries where there are economic synergies. I think what certainly is likely to happen is there is going to be some disappointment in countries like Japan and Australia, which are key strategic partners of India, and therefore Japan was pressing for India's, is pressing this case for India to be there in some way, shape, or form as part of this deal, because I think the Japanese also, like Indians, don't want China to dominate, this bloc, to dominate the region, to dominate the economic landscape. And I think at a time where India is already recalibrating its China policy across domains, and specifically we have seen a lot of policy shifts in the economic space, the RCEP in its present form could not have gone forward. So clearly what we are looking at now is how can India merge its economic more open-ended economic policy outreach to countries which are like-minded with its strategic priorities, which is to build domestic infrastructure, domestic capacities. And I think that challenge is a huge one, but that is a challenge that India will have to manage going forward, if at all the kind of discourse that we are seeing in the
Right.
region needs to be managed and needs to be protected.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Dasgupta, what are the economic implications, of India opting out of the RCEP?
The first implication, and that is has to be taken in conjunction with our policy of not allowing direct investment into India under the automatic route by firms in countries which have a border with India. But of course, we have just read that that is under review at the moment, and it may be relaxed. That up to 25% in non-strategic sectors can be invested by firms which are in countries which have a border with India. So that is something which is in the works. We don't know what will be the final outcome. As far as technology is concerned, the Chinese, and I must preface my remarks first by saying that India already has FTAs with the ASEAN, with Japan, with Korea. And Japan and Korea are the drivers of modern technology. They are the ones who are at the cutting edge of technology. Of course, China is also there. As far as Australia and New Zealand are concerned, not much comes out from there by way of new technological advances. So it is basically now China. Was it collaborating and providing assistance to India to fill this technological gap? And there, I think it was a big negative. That was not happening. Investments from China were coming in the tech industries, digital industries, and there it was basically on the with the motive to make profits and to, of course, that nobody can question, but to gain strategic advantage in certain industries. Now, that is something which, of course, does not go down well with our own ambitions and interests. So, as far as technology is concerned, we will have to look elsewhere. We will have to develop our own technology, put in more money in research and development, and attract investments from countries which are more favorable and which don't have the kind of expansionist ambitions that China had. So the PLI scheme is something which took off in April this year with mobile phones and some electronic components, then with APIs. Now we have added to that with 10 more sectors. So this is in keeping with our policy of making India not only Atmanirbhar, but also globally competitive. That is something which is a departure from the previous editions of this import substitution policy. The present policy is not just one of import substitution. It is about becoming globally competitive and, most importantly, to get on board the global value chain. So it is not that we will do everything on a self-sufficiency basis and we will remain isolated. We want to become a part of the global value chain, but we want to develop the capabilities, cutting-edge technology, and in many of the sectors where most of the goods will be traded in the next 20, 30 years.
All right, then taking the discussion forward, so Ambassador Misra, let me come across to you now. So what does this mean for the Quad? Let's not forget 2 out of the 4 Quad members are part of the RCEP as well. So what implications is that likely to have?
It will definitely have some implications at the symbolic and psychological levels for sure, because it's odd that we are talking so much about coordination within the Quad, and at the same time, all the 4 countries are not able to coordinate. On the other hand, if we look at it strategically, the United States was never in it anyway. It is a very, very even important and the pivotal member of the Quad. So that was not an option. Now, with India, the door is still open. As I mentioned earlier, they have said that India will give us a letter and will be able to join whenever India wishes. But India says its concerns have to be met, or as an observer. So therefore, Japan has been very careful trying to cajole India into joining, or at least to join as an observer to start with. And we can't close the doors. So I don't look at it as a zero-sum game. I don't look at it as, Quad versus RCEP. It can be something in between. There are gray zones in between in the real world. So RCEP, if India becomes an observer, and Mr. Ram Madhav, the General Secretary of the BJP, in fact, said that the door is still open, and I'm reading between the lines. So anything is possible. And in any case, looking at the direction of Quad, we are not sure where it's going. Will the new American government have the same level of commitment? Does Quad have a continental strategy that takes care of India's vital security concerns vis-a-vis China? Are exercises showing the flag ceremonies with some limited actual military and strategic content, or are we going to have joint operations? These are huge questions. So we don't even know where Quad is and what Quad is going to be in the foreseeable or even the midterm future. In the foreseeable or in the middle term, we don't know. So therefore, I would not put all our bets on Quad. I would not rule out engagement with RCEP. I would look at a situation somewhere in the middle. And I think something is possible in the long term if India's concerns are met. India has never said never again.
Right. Okay. Time now to get quick closing comments from all my panelists with the best way forward and considering what India's options will be in the near future. Starting first with you, Harshvi Pant.
Well, Frank, India is undergoing a massive shift in the way it looks at its economic strategy and the way it looks at its economic integration into the world. As Ambassador Dasgupta pointed out, it's not a question that India is turning inward. How that is to form up your own capacities. And I think if that is a challenge, then one has to look at every single of these measures very, very carefully. And I think India has done well in terms of assessing the costs and benefits of RCEP, and therefore coming to an informed conclusion that perhaps time is not right for India to join. I think India will face some backlash. India will face some concerns from some of its closest partners, including Japan and Australia, that perhaps India is not playing the kind of economic role that it should. But I think that's a short-term phase. In the long term, if India can manage its domestic political economy properly, if India can manage its domestic economic restructuring properly, then I think India can be a very, very credible member of the larger economic dynamic that is shaping the larger Indo-Pacific as well as the larger global reality. So I think this is something that India has taken a considered decision based on the realities here and now. For the future, we will have to build up our own capacities and see where we go from there.
Absolutely. Mr. Dasgupta.
Things which need to be pointed out is that many of the ASEAN countries and the RCEP members will have to get national ratification before they can formally join. Though the governments in power there have signed on to the agreement according to their past commitments. So that has to be seen, especially in view of the bellicosity shown by the Chinese towards many of the RCEP partners, including Australia, because they have stopped the imports of many of the products which the Australians have been exporting to China. The second point I wanted to mention that this should not be viewed in isolation, because 7 of the members of this RCEP are also part of the CPTPP, which has gone ahead without US participation. After President Biden takes over, he may, in keeping with the commitment of the Obama administration towards TPP, he may rejoin the CPTPP and take the initiative to guide that or lead that coalition into greater prosperity. So that remains to be. And the last point is the RCEP agreement. Before it comes into force, it will be 2 years. So we have to watch how the Chinese behave towards their RCEP partners, whether they are treated differently or the same aggression is shown towards, on boundary disputes and many other areas.
Absolutely.
So that is a question up for consideration.
Ambassador, close the show for us with your quick concluding remark.
First of all, we need to build our comprehensive national power, shifting from a balancing to a leading role, as Minister Jaishankar has said, and he has outlined the steps to be taken brilliantly in his speech yesterday at the Deccan Dialogue. Now, we don't need to be despondent We can even go it alone. I look at it as in a historical, in a perspective of the future, which means that India will be, according to Publico magazine, will be the largest economy in the world, from 3.7% of the world's GDP today to 19.8%. China will be 17.4%. The US will be only 10% in the year 2100. We need to think not in decades, but in 50 years, 100 years spans. And if we have to build our strength, we should be optimistic that our future is quite secure. We don't need to go it alone, therefore. We can have the partnerships that we want. Strengthen the supply chains that don't include Chinese origin or Chinese inputs. So we have the India, Australia, Japan supply chain initiative. Then do our homework on the rules of origin, educated businesses on FTAs. We are not using the benefits that we get to export from the FTAs. Tell our partners bilateral mechanisms can work as well as multilateral mechanisms. And last but not the least, never close the door on anything, any agreement.
Absolutely. All right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that RCEP is more of a China-led multilateral bloc, and the centrality is not with ASEAN. The terms don't work in our favor. There is no transparency really as far as rules of origin and tariffs are concerned. And it has political implications as well, with everything that's going on between India and China on the border. So India can't be seen going along with something that is so much in favor of China. What we need to do going forward, we need to strengthen the existing FTAs that we already have. Yes, they have been signed many years in the past, but we need to upgrade them and ensure that they are abreast with the times. And the door is still open for India as far as RCEP is concerned. If our concerns are addressed, we could as well join the RCEP sometime in the future. With that, it's a wrap. See you again next time.